We are Caucasians. Sports and politics are independent of each other in theory, but only in theory. In practice, everything is vice versa. The larger the sporting event, the more closely it is related to politics. This is best illustrated by the Olympic Games. They are so closely intertwined with politics that it is often difficult to tell where the sports begin and the politics end. The Olympics is such a mass spectacle that politicians often use it for their own purposes. Since ancient times, the Olympic Games served peace, equality, and justice. Sochi 2014, Olympics or not? Since ancient times, the Olympic Games served peace, equality, and justice. These principles are in the basis of the Olympic Games. However, the political situation sometimes leads to the fact that the Olympic Games are held in countries where the political system is far from the Olympic Charter. In the history of the Olympic Games, there are cases when this significant sporting event honors states with strong anti-democratic regimes. The 1936 Olympic Games were held in Nazi Germany. In 1980, the Soviet Union. The 2014 Olympic Games will be held in Russia, whose aggressive policy is remarkably similar to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. August 1st, 1936. In Berlin, German Chancellor Adolf Hitler speaks to the Olympia Stadium in front of 100,000 fans to open the 11th Olympic Games. In 1936, Hitler and the Nazi regime were not yet perceived as the enemy of mankind. The truth of Hitler's aggressive policy was evident initially, but the international community noted that the Nazis came to power in the country as a result of elections. Because of this, the international community viewed the beginning of Germany's campaign of racial discrimination and destruction of democratic institutions as an internal affair and responded with mild criticism. The international community did not even realize that holding the Olympics in Germany would only embolden the criminal Nazi regime.
Stolz und frei, stark und treu, doch wer auf uns nicht stößt auf Granit. Denn wir sind die braunen Soldaten, für Adolf Hitler ziehen wir ins Gefecht. Denn wir sind die braunen Soldaten und wir kämpfen für Freiheit und für Recht. Wir schlugen die Marxisten, Rot-Rot und Pazifisten für das Feld.
Berlin received the right to host the 11th Olympic Games on May 13, 1931, when the Nazis had not yet come to power. The Nazi Party had its own views on the Olympics. The Führer believed that blacks and Jews should not participate in sports, only members of the white Aryan race. After the Nazis came to power, they remained of the same opinion and did not want to hear about the Olympics. The Nazis believed the Games would spread germs of internationalism and communism in Germany. They perceived it as an insult to the idea that purebred Aryans, the Germans, had to prove their superiority against blacks and Jews. However, over time this position changed. Hitler realized that the Olympics gave him the opportunity to present fascism at its best. With the right promotion, Hitler was able to convince the international community and its citizens of the appealing, peace-loving nature of the Nazi regime. In addition, the Nazis used the sport to confirm racial theory. Hitler demanded that the Berlin Olympics be the triumph of the white race. The ministries of propaganda, foreign affairs, and security services and the police joined the preparations. To attract tourists, a whole army of special officers worked outside the country. Hitler's regime carefully masked the true face of Nazism. Police received orders to withdraw anti-Semitic slogans and limit the persecution of Jews while the Olympics were in town. The use of prisoners for road labor near Berlin was temporarily discontinued. Newspapers received a directive to refrain publishing racist articles. However, these were only external changes. Nothing really changed. As the Olympic Stadium was being built in Berlin, the Sachsenhausen concentration camp was also being constructed nearby. These Olympics were hosted by a state where all basic civil rights were limited. It was a country that had adopted the famous Nuremberg laws a year before, according to which Jews were placed outside the law.
The period of the Olympics, the Nazis didn't stop persecuting Jews, but they did things more quietly, and they didn't engage in great public acts of persecution towards the Olympics. It's very much so. The Olympics was very important for them. It had been decided before Hitler came to power that the 1936 Olympics would be in Berlin, but it was a showcase for the Nazis to show their society. And so they did a lot in order to make it look that they were nicer than they were and to make the anti-Semitism less visible. So it doesn't go away, but they try to make it less visible, and that means that there's not so many laws being passed, among other things, at that time. After the Olympics, the next stage the Nazis will enter into is something we call Aryanization, the taking over of Jewish property.
In response to the Nazi policy, the international community tried to boycott the Berlin Olympics. However, this did not produce results. The world believed that the ongoing processes in Germany were its internal affairs, and therefore they did not interfere. The leading nations of Europe did not want to spoil their relations with Hitler over the Olympics. It should be noted that the International Olympic Committee created a special commission to study the situation, but it was only a semblance of activity. Based on the conclusions by the Commission, the inspectors sent to Berlin found the situation in Germany fully adhered to the principles of the Olympic movement. Despite some resistance, the Berlin Olympiad was held anyway. It involved 4,000 athletes from 49 countries. The fascist regime, which arranged magnificent grand ceremonies and events, extracted maximum political benefit from the Olympics. More than 4 million tourists came to the Games, breaking the record for all previous Olympics. The Nazis began with the tradition brought from Greece. The symbolic Olympic flame came to the country that hosts the Games. This was the first Olympics broadcast on television. Despite the fact that Germany, in the end, took the largest number, 98 medals, and won the official competition, the Olympics dealt a serious blow to Nazi propaganda of the superiority of the Aryan race. The Olympics dealt a serious blow to the Nazi propaganda of the superiority of the Aryan race. The individual record holder in the 11th Olympics was a black athlete from the United States team, Jesse Owens, who won 4 gold medals. By not boycotting the Berlin Olympics in 1936, Western democracies failed to use an effective mechanism for deterring the Nazi regime. If the international community initially responded well to the criminal policy of the Nazi regime, perhaps it would have had a moderating influence on Hitler's aggressive policies and dispelled the dangerous illusion of the omnipotence of the Führer. However, showing loyalty to the Nazi regime put mankind on the brink of disaster. World leaders continually made concessions to Hitler in order to avoid a global conflict. They wanted to appease him. policy led to the signing of the famous Munich Agreement, when the leading European countries satisfied the claims of Hitler and Germany was given the right to occupy Czechoslovakia. European leaders decided the fate of Czechoslovakia without even inviting its leadership to the discussions. In Munich, members of the Beneš government waited for the leaders behind closed doors in the waiting room. Encouraged by this precedent, the Nazi regime divided Poland and, with the consent of the Soviet Union, decided to destroy it as a state. This led to the beginning of World War II, the Holocaust, and the deaths of millions of people. The main proponents of the Munich Agreement, French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier and British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, got the occupation of France and the bombing of British cities instead of lasting peace. After the Second World War, the International Olympic Committee recognized the error of the Olympic Games in Berlin during the Nazi era and publicly apologized to the international community for its mistake. In the second half of the 20th century, the Olympic Games increasingly began to be used for political purposes. The main form of struggle was a boycott. Although the boycotts did not produce the desired political result, it made it possible to apply serious moral pressure on the state hosting the Olympics. The boycott contributed to the formation of public opinion in the right direction, intensifying debate and attracting international attention to specific issues. The first major boycott after the Second World War took place in 1956 at the Melbourne Olympics in Australia. However, this was not a protest against the country itself. A few weeks before the Olympic Games, the Soviet Union used military force to crush the Hungarian uprising and drowned Hungary's desire for freedom in blood. In response to the Kremlin's aggression, Poland, Spain, Liechtenstein, Switzerland boycotted the Olympics. The Hungarian national team, instead of the flag of the Hungarian People's Republic, entered the Games under the banner of an independent Hungary. In protest, some Hungarian athletes refused to return home. At the same Olympics, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, and Cambodia refused to take part because of the Suez Crisis. In 1976, during the Olympics in Montreal, African countries demanded New Zealand be banned from competing because its rugby team held a meeting in apartheid South Africa. The International Olympic Committee did not support this claim because rugby is not an Olympic sport. As a result, 22 African countries boycotted the Games. But the most large-scale boycott was in Moscow's Summer Olympics in 1980. During the Cold War, as the Western and Soviet systems contested one another's legitimacy, the Soviet Union's Olympics took on a special ideological significance. It was the first Olympic Games hosted by a socialist country. The Olympics had to be the hallmark of the Kremlin, proving the superiority of the Soviet Union to capitalist countries. With the help of the Games, Moscow sought to show the world that the communist society was open, free, and attractive. For the Soviet Union, as well as for Nazi Germany, the Olympics held a decorative function. Its main purpose was not actually athletic competition, but the embellishment of the communist system and the concealment of its shortcomings. The Soviet Union had violated all the fundamental principles of the Olympic Charter. In communist society, civil rights were found only on paper. In real life, they simply did not exist. Dissent and freedom of speech were brutally repressed. There was a system of Siberian labor camps. The population was frightened and obedient. The Red Empire controlled 1/6 of the land and preserved preserved its influence in this vast territory only by arms.
свое влияние на этой огромной территории.
It always suppressed any desire for freedom with force.
Подавляло любое
Aggressive foreign and domestic policies were the natural state of the Kremlin.
являлось естественным состоянием для Кремля.
In such circumstances, no one could imagine that it was possible for the Olympic Games to be held in the Soviet Union. But the International Olympic Committee took into account the political situation in 1974 and declared Moscow the venue for the next Olympic Games. This decision did not have a deterrent effect for the aggressive nature of the Kremlin. The communist system was not going to give up its habits. Just 6 months before the Olympics, Moscow once again showed the world its true face. In December 1979, the Soviet Union, seeking to strengthen its influence in Central Asia, sends troops to Afghanistan. The Red Army occupies the whole country and provokes widespread bloodshed in the region. Despite the fact that 104 UN member states condemned the Soviet aggression, any action under the auspices of the United Nations were not possible because the Soviet Union was a permanent member of the UN and held veto power. Western countries chose to boycott the Olympics as one of the most effective methods of pressuring Moscow. The boycott was seen as a way to attract international attention to the aggression. This action was to make a significant contribution to the process of exposing and discrediting the Soviet criminal policy. The main initiators of the boycott were the United Kingdom, Canada, and the USA. On January 4th, 1980, United States President Jimmy Carter urged the International Olympic Committee to move the Olympics to another country. However, the IOC said no. On January 16th, U.S. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance states clearly that unless the Soviet Union withdraws its forces from Afghanistan, the United States would boycott the Moscow Olympics. As expected, the Kremlin does not accept the ultimatum. On February 20th, America officially announces that it will not send its athletes to Moscow and urges other countries to follow suit. Washington viewed the boycott as a nonviolent, peaceful, and at the same time efficient way to show the world and Soviet citizens the face of the evil empire. The Carter administration drew a direct parallel between the Olympics of 1936 and 1980. U.S. Vice President Walter Mondale was convinced that the Kremlin, like Hitler, was using the Olympics to cover up their criminal policy. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, not having any moral or legal right to use brute force to crush the independence of Afghanistan. Just as in 1936, when Hitler tried to shamefully use the Olympics to internationally legitimize their loathsome Nazi government, the Soviet dictators began to say that the willingness of the world to hold the Olympics in Moscow confirmed international support to the Soviet Union. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher supported the boycott of the Moscow Olympics, saying, "These games will only serve the needs of Soviet government propaganda. There are no effective half measures, such as the disruption of the ceremony. I am firmly convinced that our national and more broadly Western interests are that Britain should not take part in the Moscow Olympic Games." In order to avoid unwanted excesses during the Olympics, the Soviet leadership took unprecedented measures. During the Games, travel, road, and rail links were all limited. Dissidents, mental patients, and criminals were removed from the city. The Soviet Interior Minister held a meeting with all registered thieves in Moscow.
которые находились на учете в Москве.
The minister asked them to follow the order.
За порядком в городе.
In addition to the regular police officers in Moscow, around 15,000 soldiers provided additional security.
Безопасности.
During the Olympics, the Soviet government turned Moscow into a sterile city.
Стерильный город, где
And on the face of every citizen
гражданин
should have been a happy smile. Because of the boycott on July 19, 1980, only 81 countries participated in the Olympic opening ceremony. 64 states, in one form or another, refused to participate in the events. In terms of sports delegations, it was the smallest Olympics in the past 20 years. Just as during the Berlin Olympics, the hosts took first place. However, the similarity to the 1936 Games did not stop there. Both totalitarian regimes built sports up to the level of politics and used them to promote their own system. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union tried to manipulate the public with the Olympics and charm the international community with this pompous spectacle. Mr. President of the International Olympic Committee, world athletes, respected guests, and comrades. However, unlike 1936, democratic states did not repeat their mistake and applied moral pressure on the Soviet totalitarian regime. Unlike with the Nazis, the democratic community made it clear that they would not put up with Moscow's aggressive policy. Perhaps a boycott of the Olympics did not bring instant results, and at first sight, it was likely just psychological pressure. But it performed its task. For its attack on Afghanistan, the Soviet Union had made itself into an outcast. The Kremlin was trying to make the case that the Soviet Union was only giving assistance to Afghan workers. However, the boycott of the Moscow Olympics was a clear signal to the Soviet Union that no one believed this. On May 21st, 1861, in the Northwest Caucasus, in Sochi, in particular in the Kabada Peaks, Russia ended a war which lasted many years in the Caucasus that completely subordinated the region to their influence. On the same day in Kabada, which is now called Krasnaya Polyana, Tsarist governor of the Caucasus, Mikhail Romanov, hosted a feast and a parade to celebrate the victory of the Russian Empire in the Caucasian War. This place is now called Krasnaya Polyana, or Red Field, because of the rivers of blood shed by the Highlanders in their final battle for freedom. Beginning in the 19th century, the Russian Empire purposefully and methodically cleansed the Northwest Caucasus region of its local population. The Tsarist government intended to settle Cossacks in these territories and expel the independent-minded Circassians. About 1 million Circassians were killed as a result of the genocide, 95% of the total population. This wiped out nearly the entire Circassian people. Most died as a result of the punitive actions of the Russian army. The survivors were deported to the Ottoman Empire. The Northwest Caucasus, where Circassians had lived for tens of thousands of years, was completely stripped of its local population. In 1864, concentration camps were created to facilitate the deportation of Circassians near Tuapse. An eyewitness and participant in these events, Drozdov, described what happened. The astonishing spectacle was before our eyes on the road. The scattered corpses of children, women, elderly. Dogs ate the corpses. Exhausted from hunger and disease, the settlers could hardly lift their legs in weakness. Falling from exhaustion and still alive, they were preyed upon by hungry dogs. For those who were alive and well, there was no time to think about the dying, and their own outlook was not encouraging. Turkish captains would throw their human cargo overboard at the slightest sign of illness. The waves carried the bodies of these unlucky souls to the shores of Anatolia, almost half of them beached in Turkey. An event like this rarely comes upon mankind. The scale of the crimes committed against the Circassians are evidenced by the fact that near Sochi, 7 years after the tragic events, human bones lay scattered on the beach. Ravens made their nests from men's beards and women's hair. For 7 years, human skulls littered the beach like watermelons. We have reports that over 3 million Circassians died during and after the Caucasian War. We were intentionally killed and evicted. Is that not genocide? 140 years have passed since then, but the ethnic population of our land is still below 500,000 people. It is in Sochi, where the Russian Empire committed genocide against the peoples of the Caucasus 150 years ago, that the Kremlin is going to hold the 2014 Winter Olympics. Ski trails are laid on the graves of innocent people. Today, Russia is not ruled by czars, but Russia has not recognized the genocide of the Circassian people and always reacts very sensitively on the subject. In 1914, the Russian Tsar held a parade in honor of the 50th anniversary of the conquest of the Caucasus at Krasnaya Polyana. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin continues the imperial tradition on a much larger scale than his predecessors. In 2014, 150 years after the conquest of the Caucasus, he plans a world-class event instead of a parade.
Он вместо обычного парада планирует мероприятие мирового уровня.
The Sochi Olympics are a personal project of Russian President Vladimir Putin. They are a symbol of his resurgent new empire. Sochi will demonstrate that the Russian Empire, which was on its knees in the 1990s, humiliated and on the verge of collapse, has risen again and taken its place in the world. For Vladimir Putin and his law enforcement agencies, the Sochi Olympics will be a confirmation of the country's successful policies and rapid development. Through sports in Sochi, Putin wants to tell the world that the Caucasus is Russia's sphere of influence, and he keeps the area completely under his control. In 2007, the International Olympic Committee met in Guatemala, where it was announced that the 2014 Winter Olympics would take place in the city of Sochi in the Russian Federation.
Olympic Winter Games in 2014 are awarded to the city of Sochi.
Having won the sweepstakes, the Kremlin made the Sochi region into a military foothold rather than transform it into a zone of peace. In the summer of 2008, Moscow began to concentrate military units in the area, and during the Olympics in August, it began a full-scale military offensive on neighboring Georgia. The military rolled into Georgian territory from the Sochi area. This led to deaths of civilians, massacres, and ethnic cleansing. Russia openly occupies and, in fact, is annexing 20% of Georgian territory. This is a flagrant violation of all basic principles of the Olympic Charter. Prior to the occupation, the Russian Federation for many years supported and helped the separatist regimes in Georgia to carry out ethnic cleansing against the Georgian population. This fact was recorded at the OSCE summits in 1994, 1996, and 1999, in resolutions by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and in the report of the European Union Monitoring Mission. International organizations have confirmed the right of those displaced by ethnic cleansing to return to their homes, but the Russian government has ignored these decisions. Despite the demands of the international community, Moscow refuses to fulfill the commitments made by the President of the Russian Federation on August 12, 2008, upon signing a peace agreement that required the withdrawal of troops from Georgia's breakaway regions. Moreover, after signing the agreement, the Kremlin recognized the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where the Georgian population was expelled. By making this move, Putin has surpassed his mental predecessors, Stalin and Hitler.
Сталина и Гитлера.
The military aggression Russia carried out against Georgia is only part of the Russian policy in the Caucasus. Immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow began to struggle with desires for independence in the region. Moscow believes the Caucasus is the starting point for the revival of the Russian Empire. President Vladimir Putin clearly understands that losing the idea of reviving the region would mean the collapse of the empire.
You know, when you're talking about the leadership in Russia today, you're basically talking about Vladimir Putin, and he has shown that he really has a Soviet mindset, and he's a Soviet man. I mean, he is someone that greatly regrets the collapse of the Soviet Union. He called it one of the greatest catastrophes of the 21st century. And I think that somebody like that, Vladimir Putin, certainly has a Soviet mentality and views Georgia as a part of Russia. And I think that it's very important that this type of mentality, because it still exists, and in Moscow, many of the security structures still believe that Georgia is very vital to and very much of an obstacle to their ability to be able to reassert their influence into the South Caucasus. And for the Russians, the South Caucasus has tremendous strategic importance because it is their entree, their Platzdarm for the getting into the Near East.
Before invading Georgia, Russia launched 2 full-scale wars in Chechnya. This did not stabilize the situation in the region. Today, the Caucasus is a zone of tensions that can explode at any moment. Here, almost every day there are terrorist attacks, and, as before, there is an armed standoff with federal troops. The Olympic sites are in close proximity to a near war zone. In addition, Sochi directly borders the occupied territory of Abkhazia, where the situation is totally out of control. Terrorism and the lack of security guarantees naturally raises questions about the Olympics. According to international research, Russia is one of the top 10 most dangerous countries in terms of terrorism. Forces that would create obstacles for the Olympic Games must certainly be detected and held responsible if they are citizens of our country.
И привлекаться к ответственности, если речь идет о гражданах нашей страны.
But you also understand that certain problems exist in this respect with relation to our neighbor, Georgia. Therefore, all measures must be taken to increase attention from the side of the foreign ministry, the law enforcement units, and the police. All kinds of provocations must be duly prevented. But the Caucasus is not threatened only by terrorism, but also an ecological disaster. Russia, without any coordination with Georgia, will use Abkhazia as a part of the Sochi Olympic zone and is using its territories and natural resources for the construction of Olympic facilities in a barbaric fashion. Trees and minerals are being stripped away to such a scale that the region is under risk of catastrophic erosion. The coastline is no longer stopping the water. As a result, the Black Sea has already swallowed up to 120 meters of coastline. All of this significantly changes the microclimate of the region and over time will inevitably lead to irreversible ecological damage. Environmental standards are violated very near Sochi, where the construction of Olympic facilities is causing irreparable damage to the Sochi National Park and the surrounding area. Trees are being cut down and rivers polluted in this unique nature preserve. The Russian Federation is grossly violating the rules of the Olympic Charter, which clearly state that responsibility and concern for the protection of the environment should be encouraged. It also states that the development of sport must go together in accordance with ecological principles, and it should be required that the Olympic Games be held in accordance with the requirements of the environment. According to specialists, the Olympic Games will cost the Kremlin $33 billion. This amount is about 3 times the cost of the most expensive Olympic Games in history. Russia intends to hold the Olympics at any price, but the outlook of its government is completely contrary to the accepted principles of the Olympic Charter. The Soviet system is closer to Putin's government than the Olympic Charter. The state, which occupies the territory of a neighboring country, constantly violates the rights of its citizens, limits democracy, and wants to hold games on the site of a genocide, simply does not have the moral right to hold the Olympics. Loyalty to non-democratic systems and their support for involuntary Olympics often leads to opposite results. The absence of a rigid position from the international community allows Vladimir Putin to use the Olympics for his own propaganda. But this propaganda is an instrument of imperial policy and serves to revive the empire. Putin does not care about the tens of millions of people who were victims of the Soviet Empire. He admits that for him, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. First of all, we should admit, and I have said this before, that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of this century.
But when Putin talks about the catastrophe that he sees in the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think he's also playing just to Russian nationalism, the idea that Russia should be given more respect in the world, that Russia is a great power, and that by playing up that element of national pride, he can make Russians feel better about themselves. And Putin since has played much more on this imperial tradition. This is why he talks about the tragedy, the catastrophe of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that for Russians today, the loss of superpower status, the loss of empire, is a problem of identity. And that Russian citizens do have a tradition or an inclination, or even perhaps a temperament, to think in terms of empire.
By holding the Sochi Olympics, Putin wants to show the world that the empire is on its way to greatness, and the Kremlin is once again the master of the Caucasus. But unlike in the past century, today, the international community, fortunately, is already well aware that the rebirth of totalitarian regimes is a danger to the world. The situation is also different in the Caucasus, which expresses more and more desire for unification. Georgia's recognition of the Circassian genocide and the opening of a memorial dedicated to this tragedy, not far from the occupied territories, clearly confirms this trend. I am very happy that the dream of all the Circassians has finally come true. In May, Georgia recognized the genocide of our people, and now it intends to immortalize the memory of the Circassian victims. This memorial will be of great importance to us. It will unite the Circassians as well as all Caucasians who are not indifferent to the tragedy of our people. The Olympics, especially in the Caucasus, should not serve as a demonstration of imperial ambitions over the local population, subdued by genocide. Russia should confess its guilt and establish a spirit of trust and cooperation. After all, the Olympics are a symbol of peace, and the idea of the Olympics are based on the universal principles of human values.